Nobody knows his name with certainty. Nobody knows where he was born, or when, or whether he could truly see the world he described with such extraordinary precision that people are still reading his words 3,000 years after he wrote them. Some scholars have argued, seriously and at length, that he never existed at all, that the greatest works of literature the ancient world produced were simply assembled over generations by nameless voices, and then attributed, for the sake of convenience, to a blind poet from somewhere in Greece, who may or may not have been a single person. And yet the Iliad exists. The Odyssey exists. 24 books of verse so structurally perfect, so humanly precise, so alive with the specific texture of how people actually think and feel and suffer and hope, that the question of whether one mind produced them feels almost irrelevant beside the more important question. What kind of human being, blind, ancient, working without a single piece of technology beyond memory and language, looked at the chaos of human experience and turned it into something this permanent? This is the story of Homer, the man who may have been a myth and who gave the world its first and greatest stories. The struggle of Homer's life is, in the most fundamental sense, the struggle of trying to write the biography of a shadow. Almost everything we believe we know about him comes from sources written centuries after he is supposed to have lived, by people who were themselves working from traditions and rumors and educated guesses rather than documented fact. He was born, depending on which ancient source you consult, in Smyrna, or Chios, or Colophon, or Salamis, or Rhodes, or Argos, or Athens. 7 cities claimed him with the specific enthusiasm of places that understand, retroactively, the value of association with greatness. He lived, various sources suggest, somewhere between the 12th and 8th centuries before the Common Era, a range of 400 years that tells you everything you need to know about how little anyone actually knew. He was blind, according to the tradition that has stuck most persistently, though whether that blindness was present from birth, acquired during his life, or simply a poetic convention applied to him because of the ancient association between physical blindness and visionary insight, is a question that has never been resolved and probably never will be. What we can say with some confidence is that Homer, whoever and whatever he was, emerged from the tradition of oral poetry that was the primary literary technology of the ancient Greek world before writing became widespread. The Aoidoi, the singer poets, were professional performers who carried vast bodies of verse in memory and recited them at the courts of kings and the gatherings of communities, their performances shaped by tradition, but also by the demands of each specific audience, each specific occasion. This was not a lesser form of literary creation than writing. It was a different form, with its own extraordinary technical demands, its own conventions of composition, its own ways of managing the problem of holding thousands of lines of complex narrative in a human mind without the assistance of a page. The formulas that scholars later identified throughout the Iliad and the Odyssey, the repeated phrases, the stock descriptions, the recurring epithets like wine-dark sea and rosy-fingered dawn, were not signs of laziness or limitation. They were the tools of the trade, the building blocks of a compositional technique that allowed a poet to assemble and reassemble vast narratives in real time, in performance, in front of an audience that expected both familiarity and freshness simultaneously. If Homer was blind, and the tradition is persistent enough that it deserves to be taken seriously even if it cannot be proven, then his blindness was not the obstacle it might appear to a modern reader accustomed to thinking of literary creation as a visual, page-based activity. In the world of oral poetry, blindness was not necessarily a disadvantage, and may in some respects have been the opposite. A blind poet could not be distracted by the visual world around him. He lived entirely inside the world of sound and memory and language. He had no choice but to develop the kind of total, architectural memory that the composition of works on the scale of the Iliad and the Odyssey required. The darkness that surrounded him was not empty. It was filled with voices, with the accumulated inheritance of generations of storytelling, with the raw material of 2 of the longest and most complex narrative poems in the history of human literature. The real struggle of Homer's story is not a personal struggle in the conventional biographical sense. It is the struggle of a tradition trying to survive its own success, of stories that were so powerful, so widely known, so deeply embedded in the culture that produced them, that the question of who exactly made them became less important than the fact that they existed at all. The turning point in Homer's story is not a battle won or a throne seized or a personal crisis survived. It is something quieter and stranger and ultimately more consequential than any of those things. It is the moment, sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era, when the poems that had existed for generations as living, breathing, constantly shifting oral performances began to be written down. Because it was in that transition from the fluid, performed, endlessly adaptable world of oral poetry to the fixed, permanent, unchangeable world of the written text that Homer, as we know him, was created. Not born, created. Shaped by the technology of writing into the specific form that 3,000 years of readers have inherited and argued over and been transformed by ever since. The Greek alphabet, adapted from Phoenician script sometime around the 9th or 8th century before the Common Era, was one of the most consequential technological developments in human history, and its arrival in the Greek world coincided with, and almost certainly contributed to, the crystallization of the Homeric poems into the texts that survived. Before writing, the Iliad and the Odyssey existed as performances, each one slightly different from the last, shaped by the memory and the judgment and the audience of whoever was performing them. They were alive in the way that living things are alive, changing, adapting, never quite the same twice. When they were written down, they became fixed. They became, for the first time, objects rather than events. And in becoming objects, they became immortal in a way that no oral performance, however extraordinary, could ever be. What the writing down of the Homeric poems also did was create the question that has occupied classical scholars ever since. The Homeric question. Were the Iliad and the Odyssey the work of a single poet of genius who composed them more or less as we have them, using the traditional materials of oral poetry, but shaping them with a unified artistic intelligence that gave them their extraordinary structural coherence? Or were they assembled over generations, stitched together from multiple sources, given their apparent unity by editors and compilers working in Alexandria centuries after the poems were first performed? The question has never been definitively answered. It probably cannot be. But the fact that it has been asked continuously, passionately, and at extraordinary scholarly length for over 2,000 years is itself a testament to the power of what Homer, singular or plural, created. The ancient world did not doubt. For the Greeks and the Romans who followed them, Homer was simply the poet, not one great poet among many, but the origin point, the source, the standard against which all other literary achievement was measured and almost always found somewhat wanting. Alexander the Great carried a copy of the Iliad, annotated by his tutor Aristotle, on all his campaigns, and slept with it under his pillow alongside a dagger, because he understood that Homer had given him not just a story, but a template for what it meant to be extraordinary in a world that demanded greatness. Plato, who was deeply suspicious of poetry's power over the human mind, felt it necessary to argue at length against Homer's influence rather than simply dismissing him, because you do not argue at length against things that are not genuinely powerful. And Virgil, the greatest poet of the Roman world, structured the entire Aeneid as a deliberate response to Homer, which is the literary equivalent of the most talented architect of your generation choosing to build directly next to the Parthenon. You do not do that unless the building next door is the standard by which everything else will be judged. 3,000 years after the poems were written down, and perhaps 1,000 years before that when they first began to be performed, Homer remains the most consequential literary presence in the history of human civilization. Not the most read necessarily, though the Iliad and the Odyssey have been read continuously since antiquity without a single generation passing in the Western world that did not know them in some form. Not the most translated, though they have been translated into virtually every written language on Earth and continue to generate new translations by major poets and scholars who find repeatedly and apparently inexhaustibly that there is still something in the original Greek that no previous version has quite managed to capture. Not even the most influential in the narrow sense of direct literary imitation, though the list of works that consciously model themselves on Homer begins with Virgil and runs through Dante and Milton and Joyce's Ulysses and continues into the present day without any sign of exhausting itself. Homer's legacy is something larger and more fundamental than influence in the ordinary sense. He established the template for what a story is. The Iliad gave the Western literary tradition its first and, in many ways, still definitive treatment of war. Not as glory or as politics or as the movement of armies across maps, but as the experience of individual human beings who have names and fathers and moments of courage and moments of terror, and who die in ways that are simultaneously heroic and pathetic and real. Achilles is not a symbol, he is a person, furious and grieving and petty and magnificent. And the rage that drives the poem is not the abstract rage of an archetype, but the specific, recognizable rage of a man who has been publicly humiliated and cannot find a way to absorb it that does not cost him everything he loves. Homer understood, 3,000 years ago, what the greatest writers have understood in every generation since, that the way to make large things felt is to make them personal, that the way to make a war real is to show you one man's grief. The Odyssey gave the tradition something equally fundamental, the journey. The idea that human life is structured like a voyage, that the self is not fixed, but made and remade through experience and endurance and the encounter with the strange and the dangerous and the beautiful. Every road novel, every quest narrative, every story built around a character who leaves home and is changed by what they find and must find their way back to something they can no longer be certain exists in the form they remember. Every one of those stories carries Homer's DNA, whether the person writing it has read him or not. The structure is so deeply embedded in the way human beings understand their own experience that it no longer requires a source. It simply is the shape that certain kinds of stories take. He was, by the best historical reconstruction available to us, a blind poet working in a world without books, composing in performance, holding in his extraordinary memory the accumulated weight of generations of storytelling, and somehow, through a combination of individual genius and cultural inheritance that we will never be able to fully separate or fully understand, producing two works that have never been surpassed in the 3 millennia since they were first heard. The man himself remains a shadow, the work remains a light, and the distance between those two facts is perhaps the most Homer thing about Homer. He made himself invisible so completely that only the poems survived. And the poems, it turns out, were enough.